it'd be like you do the vote and then people will then talk about why.
5 minutes for the votes, 5 minutes opening the floor to people, and then 5 minutes comment from
Should I take the microphones around?
one. You can take one, and Valeria will take the other.
Oh, okay, yeah, that
So
makes
that
sense.
you two people are cool.
Or if
Hello everyone, thank you so much for coming to our event on a Saturday evening. Well, maybe it's not really the evening, but we're going to be going into the evening during this event, I think. But yeah, so thank you for coming, and we have a really incredible lineup of speakers here today. And actually we're just going to be focusing mostly on a bit of a youth-lensed stock take on a few different thematics that is relevant to this SB and COP27. And then I guess at the end, hopefully we can just have some discussion that's very relevant to what we're all going to be, I guess, looking at and working on in some kind of way in the run-up to COP27. But anyway, to introduce our panel today, so on my right, and this is kind of my co-moderator as well, but a bit later on, but for now, our first speaker actually, this is Jacopo from Italy, from the Italian Climate Network, who will be speaking on adaptation. And then to my left, I have Sandra from the Loss and Damage Youth Coalition, and she's from Rwanda, and will be speaking on loss and damage. And then following this, we have Delphine, and she'll be speaking on finance, and she's from the Global Youth Climate Action Fund, and also from Kenya. And then on the left, your right, is Sarah MacArthur, and she is from my organisation, the UK Youth Climate Coalition, and will be speaking on fossil fuel phase-out and the energy transition. And then at the end, we have Beatrice, and she will be speaking on governance, in particular, kind of in the youth sphere, so youth governance and youth inclusion in the UNFCCC process, and she is from Brazil. And so without further ado, let's pass over to our first speaker. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, Serena, and good evening, everybody. We already had a side event of this kind already with the more or less the same partners in Glasgow some 6-7 months ago, actually, and we were discussing our expectations towards the end of COP26. Now we are taking stock of what happened there, actually, and how do we move forward towards COP27. My role here is to start by taking stock a bit and discussing what happened in terms of adaptation and adaptation policies since COP26. So I will use my 7 to 8 minutes as follows. Well, there is for sure a persisting imbalance between mitigation and adaptation policies and the attention they actually receive from policymakers, and we are observing the same dynamic even here again at SB 56, despite some improvements from COP26 in Glasgow. Adaptation finance is still 1 out of 4 of total climate finance globally, and that's a problem. And that's the same thing Secretary Patricia Espinosa said at the beginning of these intersessionals by saying that adaptation remains somehow the forgotten element of this climate equation. At COP26, as I said, some improvements were actually made and noticed with developed countries deciding to double adaptation finance by 2025, and that was also received in the final document in the Glasgow Climate Pact. So in that sense, we could be quite happy, at least from the pledges that were made. And that's also very in line with the appeals made by UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres during these months back in the time. At COP26, 2 very important concrete pledges were made under the Adaptation Fund with additional $356 million to actually finance action, and under the Least Developed Countries Fund with new $413 million in new contributions actually declared at COP26. So in that sense, we also wrote on our blogs and reports and inside our networks that somehow some improvements were made, and that was actually true. Thing is, adaptation is extremely costly globally, and recent figures show that in, for instance, in SIDS, in small island developing countries, adaptation could cost up to 1.4% of their annual GDP. So in that sense, we see that $400 or $500 million each year is nothing compared to this urgent and dramatic need in that sense. 88% of global adaptation costs at the moment are infrastructure expenditure. So there's also a question of technological feasibility of actions. So far, we saw no major outcome from the Global Goal on Adaptation workshops so far in terms of concrete deliverables. Perhaps towards COP27 we'll have a bit more. The majority of NDCs, which we remind are supposed to be updated this year towards COP27, are conditional on foreign assistance also, and in particular when concerning adaptation actions. So what do we need is perhaps more adaptation finance together with loss and damage finance, of course, in a way that it's not they should go together. They should go together. Need for more assistance in terms of planning and policy elaboration, also at national level. Developed countries are sometimes not in line themselves with their declared ambitions. So apart from having, of course, support programs for developing national adaptation plans in developing countries, we should take also some time to observe what's happening in the global north. We saw that currently, we have 36 national adaptation plans on the adaptation website of the UNFCCC, and in October 2021, right before COP26, they were just 26, so it's a plus 10 in that sense. In 2022, Sierra Leone, Chad, Central African Republic, Costa Rica, and Madagascar presented new plans in that sense, and that's definitely positive. But if we think about, for instance, my country, Italy, we do not have a national adaptation plan. We have a strategy which is extremely old, but we never approved a plan. So also inside the G7 members, in that sense, some major political attention should be devoted to that, definitely. Speaking with governments, also in developed country parties, we often hear that problems are money, interinstitutional arrangements, and the need for a strong juridical basis versus, other level of governments and private actors in that sense. And that's exactly a lesson learned on how these adaptation plans should be developed in developed countries where still needed. So we can also ask here from the intersessionals and toward COP27, should national adaptation plans become compulsory somehow also at the regional and local level once you have a national strategy and then you stop there and you do not develop further policies? Again, in my country, for instance, the region Sardinia in the middle of the Mediterranean developed a wonderful regional adaptation plan, but it's not compulsory for other regions, for instance. By UN definition, the whole planning process under the UN should be country-driven or locally driven, gender-sensitive, participatory, and fully transparent. In this sense, also as members of YOUNGO as an organization, the question we could ask ourselves is how to bring people on board, actually, because we know how participatory processes somehow could just, preach to the same group of people every time. So in that sense, youth could perhaps play a major role in raising interest and awareness, and we can also propose from here today a youth-centered approach in compulsory participatory processes at the national level, and that's something we can also propose from the YOUNGO constituency towards COP27 and in our own national environments. So I think I made good use of my 8 minutes, if you agree, but open for questions, of course, in the second part of the panel. And thank you for now. And concerning adaptation, see you in Sharm with hopefully good news. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that. And I forgot to mention at the start, so actually during this and during all of the panelists' interventions, I'll be making lots of notes and kind of acting as a bit of a rapporteur for this session. And then at the end, I'll kind of summarize everything and maybe try and come to a way forward with it, with all of this information that we have just been given from our amazing panelists. But anyway, okay, over to the next panelist. And then actually after this, we'll take a quick 15-minute break, not to go and relax, but actually a break from the panelists and do a Menti and a bit more of an interactive session. So Sandra, over to you.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. Apologies first. This is my first panel, so I might be a little high. So I'm here as part of LDYC, which is Loss and Damage Youth Coalition. We are a mix of Global South and Global North youth that are working on the loss and damage issue. So our work, mainly, we do it in 4 groups that we have. Those are the training working group, advocacy working group, the communication working group, and the storytelling working group. In all those groups, we try to share our issues on loss and damage, our reality on the ground, so that we can make the government and other countries listen to us as youth, because in the future we are the one who will be living in a bad world with erosions, floods, and everything. And if we do not work together as right now, that will be a big issue for us. So talking from what happened in COP26 on loss and damage, we went there wanting to hear about a finance for loss and damage now, but we got only to have dialogues. They told us we could have dialogues till June 2024, but those are just dialogues that will never end. And what we want is a finance for the loss and damage. We are suffering, and some seems like to just hear it and then go. And in the last 6 months since COP, there has also been dialogues, just dialogues, talking. It seems like we only talk, but we don't say how to do or what we have to do to help those frontline communities who are suffering. And on my personal view, in the end, we all share a common home, which is our planet. And this day it might be you, the next day it might be me. So if we do not sit together and listen to each other's way of how they are affected by those impacts, I do not think it will lead us to anything. So I think we must just listen to each other and also listen to the voice of the voiceless who are suffering a lot. And also in these bond sessions, of course, we are continuing with the Glasgow dialogue. In the last 2 weeks, which will be done today, we are continuing having dialogues. We are sharing our realities, our concerns, but it seems like it is an endless talk, which they do not want to go to the point that we want. It's loss and damage finance now, because we are suffering and we need actions. But not forgetting those who did really listen. Like in COP26, we had 2 million and 3 million from the UK, from the Scottish and other philanthropist communities. That really helped the frontline communities who are suffering. But that's not enough, because when we are suffering from loss and damage, developing countries are the ones who have to take care of the losses, either irreplaceable or replaceable losses. But there are some things that they are not capable of covering, and that's why we demand finance, we demand help, and also we demand any technical support that we need to address the loss and damage issues. Also, to have succeeding COP27, we ask that we get the loss and damage finance now, not after June 2024, after the dialogues. No, we need it now because people are dying and that's not going to be replaced. Thank you.
Thank you so much to those two panelists sections. So I guess from the first one, just talking about how all of the money that's come in for adaptation, and also that, actually, let's summarize this afterwards. Let's go straight onto the Menti. I'll come back at the end and just summarize all four. I think this will be more efficient. So over to the Menti. Let me just open it. Actually, do you have to open it on this? Oh, okay, yeah. It's here. So you can scan this barcode on your mobile phone. Or is there like a number thingy?
Yeah, there's a number as well.
Okay. Or you can go to menti.com, www.menti.com, and the number is 5386-1219. So that's 5386-1219.
Let's give them 5 minutes, we say, to vote, and then we'll start.
Okay. So we'll just give you 5 minutes to vote, and then we'll come back to this.
Can you repeat the code, please? Sure, it's 5386-1219.
Okay, so you can see you'll have on your phone, how would you rate what you have just heard from 1 to 10? And you'll see two questions. One is policies and pledges on adaptation. 1 to 10, 1 is we really need to work on that. 10 is we're on the right path. And then you can rate this how you think is best. And then the second one is policies and pledges on loss and damage. Again, 1 is we need to work on that. And 10 is we're on the right path. And then I'll just give you a moment to submit this, a couple of minutes. Okay, so you can see it on the screen just behind me. Okay, so you guys have voted a bit. Do you mind actually just tilting this a bit so I can see it, the screen?
Okay, sure.
Yeah, thank you.
It's here as well.
Oh, great. So policies and pledges on adaptation. The people in this room actually think that this is a bit greater in the terms it's more on the right path than policies and pledges on loss and damage. But either both of them are below halfway. So they're both actually not that great. Halfway there, I guess we can say, between we need to work on that and we're on the right path. But we all know this is not good enough. Halfway is really not good enough. It should be all the way, should be on the right path. And that's where we want to be. And hopefully we can really push for this and lobby for this.
Well, thank you very much, Valeria.
Oh, thank you.
All right. And then we open the floor for 5 minutes interventions, and then we comment as speakers.
Sure. Okay, would anyone like to make some comments or reflections based on what we've spoken about already, or any of your own thoughts on adaptation or loss and damage? And we'll just have maybe a couple of interventions for about 5 minutes, and then we'll move on to the next two panelists. We have some roaming microphones if anyone would like to speak.
Down there, Ben?
Can you, yes, I think you can hear me. Yes, my question was more on to the panelists, but also to anyone else in the room who wants to intervene on that. On top of the reasons that you already gave on why adaptation is more neglected in general than mitigation. That it's extremely expensive. That we don't exactly know what to do in several cases. But do you think there are other reasons, or maybe we can go more in depth on the reasons why adaptation is actually a side of climate action that would actually be needed because climate change is already acting, no matter how many mitigation measures we take, and but still it looks like governments are really neglecting this side all over the world. So. Do you think there are other reasons on top of costs and on top of technical capacity why adaptation is so much neglected compared to mitigation?
Okay, thank you very much for your question. I'll start, then I would invite the other panelists to join me in answering this first question, actually. Well, I have the feeling that politically, investing in adaptation is something which requires a sort of public acceptance of the problem which is already there on the ground. And I'm not talking, of course, in terms of just the global south, where it is becoming definitely obvious that some extreme phenomena are related to what's happening with climate change and climate policies in general. But especially when it comes to finance transfer, technology transfer, and support to adaptation, that then it's somehow linked to the political narrative and what's happening in the field of loss and damage. It means that countries outside these very places, like the UNFCCC, COPs, and places where we are all used to hear this kind of reasonment in the bubble, then they should have to publicly accept that there's a clear link between this disaster, then spending, or avoiding disaster by spending, in that sense. And that's not perfectly clear everywhere, and especially when you go to government levels that are below the national one. I mean, in each country you have, of course, national strategies where they're present, of course, not talking for my country in this case, but there should be a strong political commitment to actually tell people, tell voters, tell taxpayers that it is important to prevent, it is important to avoid, it is important to help other fragile countries prevent and avoid. And that's not immediate. And here we're going well behind the classical reasoning and the things I was mentioning before in terms of technical problems and availability of resources and money. In that sense, it's more of a political acceptance of this new need. And but at least that's my feeling. At least that's my feeling. And adaptation is not something simple to think about in terms of also of political programs, for instance, or right before elections. I mean, it's easy to talk about mitigation and to say, like that just happened in Australia a few weeks ago with the victory of Albanese and the center left. It's easy to say somehow, well, we'll cut our emissions of % by this year. It's not that easy to convince people that you have to invest, to actually modify somehow the landscape, to invest in infrastructures that are fit to adapt to the adverse effect of climate change, because it's the final word in the discussion whether climate change is already there in a country or not. That happened in Australia, and we saw the outcome politically at least, but it's not the same everywhere. But that's my very humble point of view.
Many thanks for this response. I don't know if any of our other panelists would like to respond or add some more thoughts. If not, then I guess if anyone from the floor would like to respond to this or make some remarks or even give another different intervention.
Hello, my name is Kamal, and I'm sorry to try to provide some response or some thoughts about what the problem for adaptation. Just to be very simple and clear, there is less support and less consideration for adaptation compared to mitigation, because when you mitigate, you remove GHG emissions from the atmosphere, and the whole world benefit from that. But when you do adaptation actions and measures, you do it locally only, which means for the contributors, for the investors, for those that are providing funding and support, for them, adaptation is a development issue, is a local development issue. And when they invest or they provide funding, they don't have benefits or return on investment. This is the problem for them. For them, they want to do business. Most of those that want to provide contributions or provide funding, they want to do business and get return on their investments. And this is the problem. This is why developing countries in general, not only LDC seats or Africa or the most vulnerable, that are not receiving no money for adaptation. Because those that have the historical responsibility annexed to parties to the convention that are committed to provide funding are not providing funding for adaptation, because for them they consider that adaptation is a local development issue and they don't care about the local development. They care about what can be removed from the atmosphere of gases, and if they invest or provide money, they need to get return on investment, which means they need to do business. Thank you. Over to you.
Thank you so much for those very insightful interventions and all contributing to our discussion. Okay, so with that, I guess we need to move swiftly on so we can stick to time. So now going to come back to the panel and move on to a couple of our next panelists. So, hold on, let me just check who's next. Finance, great. Delphine, over to you to speak about finance.
Thank you for this opportunity. I think this is very timely. Sorry, I was about to intervene, then I remembered I'm next on speaking. So I'm glad that previous speakers have spoken about adaptation finance and loss and damage finance, which is part of a critical agenda within adaptation, within basically the finance discussions. So when we talk about issues of finance, when you look at the global landscape of climate finance by CPI, that's Climate Policy Initiative 2017-2018, you'll find that 93% of global climate finance resources went to mitigation, rather than adaptation got less than 5%. And when you look at the geographical distribution of climate finance, you'll find that a majority, over 60% of the finance mobilized at that particular time, most of it was used in the countries where they were sourced, basically. So this becomes a very key issue because countries like Africa and Asia don't contribute anything to the table. So coming back to what the previous intervention and the previous speakers have spoken about adaptation finance, when we speak to a couple of experts on climate finance and basically those who give money for climate finance, you'll find that mitigation is more preferred than adaptation. This is basically because for basically my intervention and my engagement, mitigation is easier to quantify compared to adaptation. Because when you look at mitigation, look at the mitigation projects. Let's say we are funding cook stoves. We get 1 million cook stoves. What the donor wants to see is this 1 million at the end of the day. So it's easier for the donor to quantify, basically. When it comes to adaptation, it is very hard to quantify. Even defining adaptation indicators for especially Africa and Asia and those, it's very difficult because there's a lot of technical work that needs to go into this particular agenda. So you'll find, because the donor giving money, they have to align this money to their KPIs. And they don't just give you money, they have to report back. So you'll find this is why most of the time adaptation gets less money, of course, than mitigation. But coming also on the issue of still on adaptation and mitigation, we know that Adaptation Fund, I think, was meant to serve the Kyoto Protocol. Protocol. But of course, the Kyoto Protocol ended, and now we're moving towards, of course, the Paris Agreement. And I think the last discussion was that it was agreed that Adaptation Fund would serve, of course, the Paris Agreement. So there's a bit of transition and shift. So I think that it's an opportunity, of course, with, of course, new issue of membership to the Adaptation Fund Board for discussions to continue ongoing on issues of adaptation financing and adaptation funding. To close on adaptation, before I jump on to other climate finance related issues, basically, I think to be able to receive any form of financing, from my experience, I think Kenya is a very good case. You must set the domestic enabling environment, basically. So what is the domestic enabling environment? Is basically your country ready to receive money, basically. So how is your country ready to receive money? Do you have the National Adaptation Fund? Do you have the right coordination mechanism? For example, in Kenya, I think the main body coordinating climate finance is the National Treasury, which is also like a Ministry of Economy, but it coordinates, of course, with the Ministry of Environment. Do you have that sort of national level coordination and readiness, and also political goodwill? Because in our country, we have a National Climate Change Council chaired by the President himself. So why would we not receive money? And Kenya recently received money from World Bank for financing locally led climate action. So I beg to disagree with the previous speaker, and it is a huge sum. Money supposed to go to the sub-national level, basically. So we've sort of set up a National Climate Change Fund, basically, and we are setting up sub-national climate change funds in all the 47 countries. When you look at the history of, I want us to understand climate finance from the environmental finance agenda. Start with the Rio Earth Conference of the 1992. Environmental finance develop. The countries are supposed to mobilize 40% of the climate financing needed to address environmental issues. International community is supposed to mobilize the other 40% to co-finance. So this is where the concept of co-financing basically comes in, basically. So the country has to put in the effort first. So this is why the GEF was formed, hosted, of course, by, I think, UNEP or something, then the Adaptation Fund, then, of course, the GCF came into place. So we need to really understand what is really happening on issues of climate change and climate finance. I'm sorry to take up, to monopolize the discussion. I'm not attacking my previous speakers. I'll jump up onto loss and damage financing. So I think the key issues, of course, we've seen the Santiago network on loss and damage, and we wanted a facility and all that. I think the key issues, of course, within is how do we differentiate loss and damage loss and adaptation loss, because adaptation in itself is already a key issue. So these are some of the drag in engagements and negotiations that are actually sort of roadblocks, basically, for most of us. But I actually do believe that I think there should be additional financing, of course, for loss and damage, basically. And of course, because when we talk about, we need to be very careful when talking about loss and damage finance. And now that you're talking about Adaptation Fund and membership to the Adaptation Fund Board, which is now going to serve the Paris Agreement. Because if the Adaptation Now Fund is going to serve the Paris Agreement, basically, then, of course, it means that the issue of loss and damage might be tucked under Adaptation Fund, because how do we differentiate these two issues, basically? How do you say this is loss from adaptation and this is lost from, so there's a bit of a key issue here. Not to monopolize, of course, the whole conversation. Climate finance is a very expansive topic, basically. I think we can all agree with that. I will touch on another key critical issue that is, disturbing the climate finance discussions, basically. I think from the beginning, from the word go, when you started talking about climate finance, there is no globally agreed definition of climate finance. So you'll find different people have different definitions of climate finance. The SCF has an operational definition. Other countries, so even entities like CPI, that's Climate Policy Initiative, there's a bit of issue in tracking the climate finance flows, because there's basically the risk of development finance being counted as climate finance, which should not be the case. of course, and then also the risk of double counting. So these are the issues that are, of course, are very critical to, of course, this particular agenda and on basically for all of us, basically on climate finance agenda. So we need to look at that. But I think since I've been here, I think for the few minutes I've been at SB 56, I know that the SCF was consulting basically on a proposed definition of climate finance, because this is the main key issue, because what do we count as climate finance and what we call as development finance? So I heard that I've not yet confirmed. They've started consultation with parties, of course, and consultation with other non-party stakeholders like the youth people, like the young people. But for my organization, looking to set up a youth fund institution, independent fund institution, I would say climate finance, it makes sense to me, is support given, of course, to the younger generation by the older generation to mitigate and adapt to the impacts of climate change, as highlighted by the IPCC report. This is my definition, our definition. So these are some of the issues that are there. Of course, just not to take up the whole time, other issues, of course, that were very critical at COP26. The $100 billion resource mobilization, we were at 80, of course. And I think recently people were mandated, the SCF or the COP was mandated to basically follow exactly, which was supposed to follow up, to do like a follow-up report on a formula to get to this $100 billion goal, because we didn't meet it in 2021, you're supposed to be in 2020 because of, we all know the history of the Paris Agreement and the finance goal. So this is of course one of the critical issues basically, and I know that there's a new goal that is being proposed. It's called the new collective quantified goal on climate finance. It's the post-2025 goal basically. So we are hoping that by 2025 we'd have met the $100 billion goal. So we still don't know, given we can't define climate finance and all the other issues. There's something I needed to basically bring to the close before I hand over the session, basically. So to conclude, I would say there's a lot of topics around climate, a lot of material around climate finance. There's need to align climate finance with, of course, the development agenda, because when you talk to the donor, when you look at the donor, they want to see sort of a return on investment. What the previous speaker intervention said is actually true. Most donors want to give you a return on investment. And if Germany gives a pledge, it doesn't mean that the government of Germany is going to remove money from its budget. It might do that, but it's going to go to the private sector, basically, those German organizations, to give money towards supporting these particular actions. So we need to align ourselves and look at climate finance with a green growth and a green economy agenda. That will make it easier for us to be able to access financing, for the governments to be able to access financing, and all sorts of that. So what my organization is doing is looking at the existing financing mechanisms, basically at the global level, at the regional level, at the national level, and at the grassroots level. And what we are going to do and what we intend to lobby for is to ask, because we have a good case at national level. We have the National Climate Change Fund. We have the Sub-National Climate Change Fund. What we are going to tell our government is we want 2% of the National Climate Change Fund to go to young people, 1% of the county climate change fund to go to young people. Then we're going to move on to regional bodies. Give us 5% of what you have. Then we're going to go to global bodies like the GCF, the GF. Tell them we want 10% of what you have to go to young people and support issues of climate change. So I'll stop at that. There's so many things that I haven't touched on, but I think I don't want to run away with the whole session. So thank you.
There is a planned handover in moderation, so now for some minutes it's up to me. And I would like to build on this last thing you were saying, Dolphin, in terms of climate finance is such a wide topic, and with many different parts you can actually tackle it from. And if you were, before going to the next speaker, if you were to provide the audience today and people watching from home, from YouTube, some keywords to help our action as youth organizations or in general organizations actually attending the COPs and trying to build a movement on a topic that could appear somehow obscure to the majority of people. As a young finance expert, which keywords would you suggest?
I'm sorry, I'm never simple, I'm a bit complicated. So I think all of us have gone to the basic math class, right? And we know the graph of y is equals to mx plus c, right? The graph that goes through the y-axis. So what I would tell young people over there, draw your graph, basically, and of course, the x-axis, then the y-axis. Then what you should imagine when it comes to climate finance, the x-axis represents the older generation, the y-axis represents the younger generation. So our equation is y is equals to mx plus c. So y is the younger generation, x is the older generation, m is a value to be quantified, and c is climate finance, basically. So think about it. I'd be happy to talk more about that, but this one is more than enough justification that because the more we wait, the more we head towards 2030, the more finance we're going to need. If they keep saying that by 2025 we would have met the $100 billion goal, already I think in my country we had a couple of counties declare a drought emergency. By the time we get to 2025, if we needed 10 million to begin with, we will need 100 million, basically. And who are the stakeholders at the end of the day? It's young people who are going to lose, because when we get to 2030, that everyone is talking about, I'm sorry to say, I might be the Minister for Environment. I'm not saying I will be, I might be. And I will have to undo or build on, I will either undo bad policies or I will have to build on the good policies that have been set. So I think climate finance is just for young people, just to say, but look at the graph, y is equals to mx plus c, and go for your money, ask for your government for your money, because it is our money. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dolphin, and unfortunately we haven't heard that good news recently from G7 and other multilateral platform in that sense, but we will show that graph to as many people as possible. And I would like to now move further and by giving the floor to Sarah MacArthur from the UK Youth Climate Coalition, and she will tell us a bit more fossil fuel phase out progresses or not, and the energy transition since COP26. Sarah, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Jacopo. Hi, my name's Sarah MacArthur. I'm from Scotland and I'm a volunteer with the UK Youth Climate Coalition. I also work in the development of onshore wind in Scotland, and I did my master's in sustainable energy before that. So I'm going to touch on the topic of fossil fuel phase out and the energy transition. So that's a big topic to cover in just a few minutes, so I'm by no means going to get into every detail. But for me, there were four main takeaways from COP26, and so I'll touch on each of them, review how I see progress that has been made since COP26, and then look towards COP27 and how we can push for progress there. I would just like to highlight now that I am 24 years old. This is my first intersessionals. COPs have been held since before I was born, and we have seen nowhere near the level of progress that we need. In order, I guess, to make sure that I and all other young people have a livable planet in the future. And I'm here to contribute my understanding of fossil fuel phase out and the energy transition. But whilst I have the credentials, I guess, to call myself an expert, I'm still trying to work out how this damned UNFCCC system works. So we'd really love to hear all of your thoughts and key takeaways as well on this. There's a really big conversation to be had around this topic. So, yeah. Stating the obvious, the rapid, urgent need to phase out fossil fuels is really critical if we are to meet the 1.5 degree target. The reliance on fossil fuels by countries like the UK, where I'm from, is the key reason behind the climate crisis, and the burning of fossil fuels has actually been responsible for 86% of all emissions of greenhouse gases in the past 10 years. I'm sure I don't need to tell you about how the extraction, consumption of fossil fuels has been a key driver in capitalist growth in the global north over the past 2 centuries, and it has been underpinned by forcibly extract resources and labour from the global south. Yet we sit here at the Intersessionals Climate Conference, and yet there's hardly been a mention of fossil fuels in climate treaties agreed at the UN. The Paris Agreement has been hailed as a historic achievement in the climate crisis, yet there is no reference to this huge driver in its making. And I mean, the reasons for this are that many countries have consistently argued that the UNFCCC should not be considered as an energy treated, as if you can separate these two issues. So yeah, the energy landscape has changed quite a bit this year and since COP26. I guess stating the obvious again, the unprovoked invasion of Ukraine has really shifted the geopolitical landscape of energy, and this has driven oil and gas prices to their highest prices in about a decade. And many countries are reconsidering their energy supplies as a result of this. According to the International Energy Agency, Russia is the world's largest oil exporter, and also its gas fuels a lot of the EU. So as countries have been announcing sanctions on Russia, including commitments to wean off their fossil fuels, this really should be an opportunity to double down on growing domestic renewable energy and boosting energy efficiency measures as well, which is hardly ever talked about. I could go into a lot more detail here, but I will come back, I guess, to COP26 and what was agreed there in relation to fossil fuels. It was by no means enough, but we did finally get a mention of fossil fuels, specifically coal, in the final agreed text, which called on parties to accelerate the phase down of unabated coal power. The original draft text refers to phasing out coal power, which is a really important distinction. But this was ditched after we saw India read out a statement to request this change. What we actually saw in the media after this was India getting the blame for this. The brunt of the blame landed on India, which is categorically unfair. They reported that it was language that was actually introduced by the US and China in a statement. They were simply asked to read out this statement. So often the intricacies of the UN processes are lost because it's a really complicated system. And I think this one is extremely important to note, as the USA will have also welcomed this changed language. So I guess since COP26 and this agreement, we've seen India announce in April that they would increase the production of coal power and reopening 100 new plants. But at the same time, they do have a target for 500 gigawatts of solar and wind by 2030, which is a really, really huge number. So I personally am hopeful that, in fact, a lot of this new coal may never come about if this renewable energy is focused upon and can be properly scaled up. Another key outcome was the South Africa Just Energy Partnership, which was announced at COP as well. This is the overall aim to accelerate South Africa's decarbonisation. This has yet to be fully implemented, and in fact I was trying to do some research about this earlier and could really find very little public knowledge about how this has moved forward since COP26, which is disappointing. There have been announcements that Vietnam and Indonesia may be getting involved in a similar partnership, but this is definitely something then to keep up with in the lead up to COP27. But yeah, like I said, there's not a huge amount up there at the moment. I think it's a really important partnership to note because we are all aware, obviously, that those countries and communities who have contributed the least to the climate crisis are those that are bearing the brunt of its impacts. And so I'd very much like to see partnerships like these being replicated and see other developed nations pledging and then following through, most importantly, to provide adequate support to other countries. We also, thirdly, I guess, saw the international public support statement for the clean energy transition. I think I'm saying that right. This was signed by 30 countries who they essentially committed to ending the financing of international fossil fuel projects. Again, this was highlighted as a really key outcome of COP26, but I guess what I would say to this was, well, where were these countries' commitments to ending domestic projects? Countries have been included on this list that include Germany, who we've seen boosting their renewable energy targets, but we've also sadly seen them announce the intention to support Senegal in gas exploration, which will of course directly contradict this pledge. And I think this problem really clearly highlights what we see a lot in the UNFCCC is that there's a lack of sufficient accountability mechanisms to stop countries sliding back on their commitments. And otherwise, these are just empty words, empty promises that do nothing to push forward any sort of improvement in how we're going to tackle the climate crisis. So yeah, Germany get a low mark from me. Progress on renewable investment means very little if you're still pushing through new fossil fuel projects. And finally, we saw the launch of the Beyond Oil and Gas Alliance, or BOGA, during COP26. This was a lot of fanfare around this announcement. It was led by the governments of Costa Rica and Denmark. The clue is in the name. The core members have committed to ending new leasing rounds for oil and gas. So another important shift in the UN dialogue, which has traditionally ignored how we're going to phase out fossil fuels. The problem, I guess, with this alliance is that those countries that signed up account for less than 1% of global oil production. So this alliance really needs an increase in membership fast, which they did say would happen. There was several countries, including Scotland, which had said that they would sign up. Not seen this come to fruition yet. And also, very sadly, since the announcement of BOGA, we've had a new president come into power in Costa Rica. I learned this just the other day, actually, at another side event. I was really disappointed to learn that they are set to start exploring new gas reserves. Costa Rica have long been looked at as a leader in the climate action field. 98% of their electricity comes from renewable energy, and they have a lot of really other pioneering projects and commitments as well. So that was really disappointing to see, and sort of takes them down in my eyes as not being that climate leader that I really want to see them be. So what I see, I guess, is key in the lead up to COP27 is countries continuing to grow their renewable energy capacity. But that is not good enough alone, as I just said. Countries need to phase out fossil fuels and not invest in and build more infrastructure that will just lock us into dependence on fossil fuels for the next 30 years or more. So here we have the UK as a shining example of doing just that. The UK is the most profitable place for the fossil fuel industry, and as someone who works in the renewable sector in the UK, I do see that it is booming and the output is growing here, but there's still lots to be done to boost this even further. I won't go into, I guess, detail about that right now. But as the UK government, as COP26 presidents, they've not put nearly enough focus on moving away from fossil fuels. It's in fact been quite the opposite. There have been several new fossil fuel projects created and approved in the UK since COP26, in fact, and this includes the Jackdaw gas field, which was approved just last week off of Scotland, which is set to create more than half of Scotland's annual emissions. And reports show that there are at least 50 new similar schemes in the pipeline over the next 3 years. And the idea that these new projects are needed in the UK to keep the lights on, as politicians so like to say, it's just categorically untrue. We have more than enough existing oil and gas in the North Sea, and to do this, and we just need to be investing more in renewable energy and also energy efficiency to improve this ability. So yeah, the UK government gets a very big fail from me in terms of their progress. To summarise, I guess, the landscape, the renewable energy and energy landscape has really changed since COP26. This does not take away from the urgent need to move away from fossil fuel dependence and transition to an equitable and just renewable energy system. We need proper accountability mechanisms to be enforced so that we're not seeing countries backslide on these promises, such as we saw with Germany. And we need to see rich global north countries absolutely take the lead here and not to shirk their obligation to the global south. And ultimately, we need world leaders and governments to act like their house is on fire, because it is. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sarah, for your thoughts and consideration and figures and data as well. One quick question before moving to the next speaker. You've been talking about the amount of out-of-the-room agreements, let's say, that we saw at COP26, which were also somehow facilitated by the amount of political capital that, at least initially, the UK government spent into COP26. Do you think that this two-speed system could continue in the next years in terms of when we touch the most economically sensible issues, such as, again, energy systems, and in terms of COP27, COP28, COP29, will we see, or it is, should we expect to see this kind of double-speed agreements with people outside of the UNFCCC room negotiating more ambitious pledges, or what do you think, guys, in a nutshell, please?
I think the answer is yes. We will continue to see pledges like that being made outside of the official UN space. This is because the UNFCCC works on consensus, so everyone needs to agree to things. So that's like how I touched on at the start about the phasing down instead of phasing out of coal power. This was because countries were disagreeing about the language, so they had to come to a consensus and compromise. Compromise is a big word in the UN speak, and so I think there will continue to be conversations outside of the official negotiating spaces so that you have alliances like BOGA coming forward. But what we need to do is there needs to be more pressure on other countries to be getting involved in this too. And also, I think an important point about these deals, the backroom deals that they call them, means that not every country can get involved with those. A lot of smaller countries don't have these large delegations, like say the US and the UK do, so they don't have the ability, the capacity to get involved in every single backroom negotiation that's happening, and that's where it's really important to have a balance. And at the end of the day, the really big decisions should be coming together and being agreed on in the main negotiating space.
Thank you very much. I would like to thank Sarah MacArthur for her intervention today, and I will leave the floor to Beatriz Pagi, if I pronounced that correctly, from the Youth Climate Council, Brazil. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Yes, it was perfect. All right, so just to give a little bit of context before we get into this topic, I'm talking about governance and civil society and youth participation in this process, but not only in the UNFCCC, but also in the national and subnational level. And I think this is very important to advance climate action and climate justice. So, as many of you know or may know at this point, not every country has this consistent compromise with climate action, and Brazil is one of them. We used to be at least an example of diplomacy and trying to advance negotiations and bring innovative solutions to the table. And since the last elections, that completely changed, not only in the international level, but also in the national level. And our NDC in Brazil, when we had to present a new version, we actually managed to do a huge scam and change the baseline of what our emissions were. And we delivered a less ambitious NDC. And this is critical and definitely something that we should avoid at all costs. But how can we actually go beyond all this discourse and all these conversations that we're having here and assure that even with the pledges, we're actually implementing this in the national level? And I think that right now, when we finish wrapping up all these guidelines and negotiations and those open agenda items that we have here in the SB and the COP, all comes back to what are you going to do at home? And not only as the governments, but also as civil society. So we need to create this space for action and enabling space for civil society to be not only an observer, because most of us are here as observers, but as active stakeholders being part of the decisions. So what I can say in the international level, and I think that some of my fellows from Yango are here, we did have some advances, and at least in people being present in the rooms. And last COP, at least in the Brazil side, I think we had the biggest civil society participation. And the COP presidency also, and I believe that some of the constituencies brought the numbers on how much, in terms of percentage, people were there. But how meaningful is that participation? I think that's also always the question that comes to my mind. Because aside from packing the side events and the corridors, how can we have this successful climate advocacy happening that advances the negotiations? And I know that some of the good practices that we have the constituencies as the official channels to lobby for that, to advocate for that, to connect with people. And for young people, that's supposed to be Yango, to have, through the working groups, pushing for those technical topics that are very difficult to many people and not accessible to the majority of people that don't even have access to the space. And one of the working groups that I want to complement here is the Action for Climate Empowerment working group. That's a topic that's very related to civil society participation and youth inclusion, but also a small parenthesis that youth participation is not only about ACE. Youth should be included in a cross-cut manner and not be renegated to just this topic. And I think that's very comfortable and oftentimes tokenistic to just put youth in participation and in a consultative manner. So, even still, I think some of the advancements that we had in this specific agenda that talks about participation was that last COP we did approve a new program, a new ACE program, that's the Glasgow one, for the following 10 years. And one advancement that is happening here right now is discussing the ACE strategy. So how can we make this broad umbrella program that was not executed in the past 10 years actually have concrete action? And this is a very innovative idea and something that is really, really good. But how can we, beyond having a strategy, reflect that in the national level and reflect that with broad participation? And we should push now for implementation, not only of the Paris Agreement, but of the NDCs as well, and of those specific technical strategies, including the ACE one. And some of the pledges that Youngo and many other groups that work with ACE are doing right now is pushing for not only national focal points of ACE that would advance the civil society participation and increase this governance structure, but also having youth focal points for ACE. And also, as always, we cannot escape finance, so obviously having a way to put money into those initiatives of the countries, their capacity building, but also of youth and civil society. So that's how the group has been advocating for the ACE marketplace to matchmake those projects with concrete ideas. But moving beyond that, and now I want to talk about how we integrate this vertically then, because we all come here and it really doesn't matter if we only are active in these few days of the year. We are very few, and it's just a very limited time. We have to ensure that we have mechanisms, ways for us to keep working on this daily, to keep pushing for this, so this is not forgotten and just discussed by a few negotiators, and then all the other decision makers in our home don't talk about this or don't even have the capacity to talk about this. In Brazil, in particular, even though almost 80% of civil society, according to some research that the Climate Observatory, the biggest Brazilian network of organizations, NGOs in Brazil held, almost 80% of people care about climate. Almost 80% want to push this, are against Amazon deforestation, for example. But still, less than 25% of our decision makers even recognize climate, even mention climate in their plans. So how come we can come here and have an NDC or make all these compromises and then we come back and in the city level we are facing floods and droughts and people being forced to migrate, and this is not even seen as climate. The climate narrative is not mainstreamed. It's not internalized in people's heads. They just see this as something that's naturalized and that's just how it's supposed to be. And it's becoming the new normal when this is absurd. 10 years ago, it wasn't like that. But it becomes more and more normal. And no action is being taken. So my NGO and the work I've been doing is how to create this vertical integration between the policies. How can we bring those technical languages and make it very, very accessible and simple for people that are actually living this in their real life and empowering them. So I believe that the relevance of subnational governments and this vertical integration is fundamental, not only empowering cities and mayors to talk about this, but also including other stakeholders that are not only civil society and youth, but legislators and your councillors, and creating those spaces for discussion and to push and to pressure this to happen. And legislators are often, some of them come here to the COP, to the SPs, but they are not part of the action. And they are a fundamental piece to create monitoring and evaluation of what the executive power is doing, to create concrete policies in a consultative manner, to bring more transparency to this process and to put us sitting at the table as well to make those decisions. And another topic as well about the cities, like everyone here lives in a territory, in the concrete. A nation is a very abstract thing, but when you're talking about a city, that's something that's way closer to your reality. And according to UN Habitat, cities consume almost 80% of the world energy. And it produces more than 60% of the green gas emissions. So it might seem very, very far away, and that makes us hopeless and think that we don't have the power to do anything about that. But we could be influencing policy in the city level and in that national level, beyond this international space, and having very concrete actions related to sanitation, to energy, to how we move around in cities and move around in our life. And very few cities actually have climate action plans. So how can we push for this and even move forward from that? And yeah, one very simple example, and I'm closing with that, would be the Youth Climate Councils. So I'm part of this initiative called the Youth Climate Council Global Alliance, and we're trying to create this institutional mechanism for young people and civil society to have direct access to the government, to sit in a collaborative manner and not only confronting them, but bringing the ideas to the table and being part of the creation, the monitoring, and the implementation of public policy. And that covers all the different topics, not only about ACE, not only about finance, but everything that is related to climate in an intersectional way. And it's fundamental for us to create those mechanisms for us to be in day-to-day pushing for the agenda and creating this in a way that's connected to our reality, to our values, and to what we really believe that should be the way that we are advancing policy. I hope that this could be an inspiration to some, but also a path for us to act together and go beyond words. I think any young person here could push to have a youth climate council in their countries, to push to have more participation in policy, and to bring their activism and their advocacy to the next level, and to make this maybe your green job of the future and transform the way that we're doing policy in our daily life. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Beatrice, for this very wide perspective on governance and how to include young people, also building on your national and local example. And COP26 has also been the COP of the first intersection between the young UKOI process with the Youth for Climate process from many points of view. And I also see some Youth for Climate delegates in the room today. And it's useful to remind that Youth for Climate is continuing, and there will be another session in New York at the UNGA in September this year. So perhaps we can also hear from some of you how this process is moving forward. But before getting to there, same exercise as before. We have a very nice Menti, same code as before. For those who haven't scanned the QR code, here it is again. And for those who have the page open in their browser on the phone, you can still click there. And now we are asking, what do you think in terms of the progress being made on these policies, starting from COP26 until, towards COP27 in terms of climate finance, fossil fuel phase out, and governance and youth inclusion? So let's give ourselves 5 minutes to see what happens here with this new vote before proceeding forward.
Can I just say, please don't hurry through this, because these interventions from the panelists were so amazing and so full of information. Now I have to quickly summarize everything, and this is going to be a very hard job, so take your time.
All right, and for those who need the code, it's menti.com, and you can type 5386 1219. All right, many of you voted already, and some people from home are voting as well, I suppose. And yeah, perhaps we can move forward from here. So we see lower grades compared to adaptation and finances. Compared to what we saw before. So in terms of policies and pledges on climate finance and the everything that we heard so far from the local to the international level, the average grade is, the average vote is 3.3, not much actually, and I suggest that we all agree here from the panel. In terms of policies and pledges on fossil fuels, phase out 3.7, a bit more, but still, perhaps this kind of multilateral agreements at COP26 helped a bit, but not that much, as Sarah was telling us just some minutes ago. And in terms of policies and pledges on governance and youth inclusion, we're still far from the goal, apparently, as with a 3.8 grade, we're definitely, still far away from 10 and complete satisfaction from the many in the room and watching from home. So now the floor is yours in terms of if we have questions or comments, also on the results that we see on screen or on something that you've heard so far, and then from the panel we will also comment these results and complete, let's say, this discussion together today before hearing the amazing wrapping up from Serena. Right? I see a question here and a question from there. So thank you, Ben.
Cool. Thank you. Hi. Y'all did a really great job. It's really interesting to hear all of the different work streams that I don't follow and hear more information about them. And so y'all did a great job presenting. As mentioned, I am part of Youngo, and I do work with the ACE working group, so I kind of wanted to maybe add a comment with a question is, the example of ACE and young people being included is a really good point in the fact that it's just one example and should not be the only place that young people are included. But I also see it in my mind as a win for youth inclusion in the sense that if we can include it in one spot and get it in to one place in a work stream, we can use it as an example to get it into other work streams. And so I tried to see it in a positive light. I know I also voted like a 2 on here, so it's definitely not where it needs to be. But that's actually my question for other people is, ACE is a little bit easier of an entry point because it's a little bit less technical than finance and loss and damage, and it's a little bit easier to catch up. So I'm wondering from the panel, how do you feel like young people can best be involved in other work streams that you just talked about here, from your opinion, with maybe keeping in mind that really technical barrier that can be in the way of any young person joining. I don't know if you want to respond, or I can pass. He also had a question.
Thank you. Actually, I will talk about the fossil fuel phase out. I mean, if we are talking about fossil fuel phase out, some countries, they are in unstable situations. They don't have indices. They don't even work inside their countries on building infrastructures, or they even have conflicts. And those countries based on oil industry, more than 60% till 92%. I'm from Libya, where the country's economy depends on the oil industry, 92%. And if the energy transition happen in that way as the global north, or even the global south countries that they don't depend on the oil industry won't, so then in that time we will be left behind. So in this case, if we don't have the alternatives and stability for countries that in conflicts or where the infrastructure is not prepared well for such a transition, so the transition will also leave people behind. And for that, we have to work all together. And those countries, they even they don't have the government that work on a priority for the climate. They don't give a priority for the climate. So we create an international initiatives relating to that. And that's why I gave 10 for that. Anyone else?
Thank you very much. There's a question down there as well, and then I think we can have a first to the table.
Buenas tardes. Mi nombre es Nora, yo soy de Colombia y voy a hablar pues en español, ¿no? Precisamente solo haré un comentario que Hanna me va a ayudar a traducirlo y es lo siguiente, ¿no? Aún como jóvenes pedimos ser escuchados precisamente en estos espacios, pero debe ser en un formato, en un mismo lenguaje, en la cual de una u otra manera invisibiliza muchas veces a la gente del sur global. Y esto también me lleva a pensar que las políticas están diseñadas para responder a las mismas problemáticas que tiene Europa o Norteamérica. Principalmente porque nadie en este espacio pensó que si todos entendíamos el lenguaje. Por ello considero fundamental el repensar el trabajo de los jóvenes si verdaderamente estamos garantizando una participación que elimine las barreras de lo colonial.
Okay, I'll try to translate. So my name is Nohora. I'm from Colombia. I would like to make a comment. As young people, we ask to be heard in spaces like in this event. However, it has to be within a format designed, for example, to be heard in another language. Not being able to speak in the same language forces us to adapt to this format. It makes us invisible, and this often happens to people from the global south. And this leads me to think that policies are designed to respond to problems that exist in Europe and North America. Because surely you thought that in this dialogue we all understand the language. That is why it is fundamental to rethink the work of young people if we as young people truly guarantee a participation that eliminates the barriers of neocolonialism. Thank you.
Thank you very much for all these questions from the floor. Muchas gracias por tu pregunta también. And I would like to quickly give the floor for a really 1 minute answer to the other speakers and panelists before we wrap up and we tell you how to move forward from this event to COP27. Just to summarize, we had a question on how to break barriers to youth participation on technical topics. We had another question on how to break, let's say, colonial barriers on youth participation in terms of language and making events and negotiations understandable to young people who do not speak English. Definitely. And a question on transition in rentier countries with conflicts, as in this case. And I will start with the last question from Sarah, maybe, and then we can go to the other ones. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your question, because that is the critical point of the energy transition. Is we can't mandate how it's going to happen everywhere. It needs to happen differently in different countries. And the reliance on fossil fuels by the global north has been a really destructive process, and it is really important that we are, yes, the global north can move away and has the resources and the finances to invest in renewables, but the support needs to be going to other countries who haven't had the opportunity to develop in the same way by using fossil fuels. And to that, I would say that areas like decentralized renewable energy schemes are really, I think, a really crucial way that fossil fuels do not have to be locked in to other countries, because at the end of the day, it will be a really dangerous path to carry on down. And in terms of how that can tie into conflict as well, we're seeing the energy markets are currently really, really tense and moving very quickly because we're relying on international markets for energy prices. And if that can be moved into a more decentralized manner where we don't have to rely on really volatile prices, then that will give other countries more stability. It will mean that they have access to energy, and that development needs to be at the forefront of government's mind. And yeah, I think there's a danger in some narratives with the transition to renewable energy that this needs to happen fast and it needs to happen everywhere. And I really disagree with that, because we all have very, very different responsibilities and capacities, and that has to be reflected in UN outcomes.
Thank you, Sarah. Maybe Beatrice, then Dolphin, then Sandra, just for a 1 minute comment on the questions we got.
Gracias, Alejandra, por su pregunta. I'm going to answer directly in Spanish and then I can translate to everyone. Yo voy a responder en español, después traduzco para las otras personas. Creo que el proceso es creado para ser una forma de neocolonialismo. No se están haciendo muchos esfuerzos para superar este sistema. Y la sociedad civil y la juventud, especialmente los jóvenes de pueblos indígenas, de comunidades locales, no tienen un espacio consolidado por acá. Y todo eso es de propósito. Cuanto menos participación, más fácil es que el proceso siga como está, siga con las estructuras de poder. Y sí, es verdad. Y es nuestro papel como jóvenes y como representantes de estas minorías que infelizmente tenemos que hacer más esfuerzos para estar por acá y transformar este sistema en algo más participativo, significativo y que nos represente. Creo que es mi opinión. So what I said is that unfortunately those spaces do not have efforts to be decolonial. This is a deliberate choice to make this less participatory. The whole UNFCCC process is not made to accommodate young people, and not only young people, but representatives of minorities in general, indigenous people, people from local communities. And it's easier to maintain the power structures when you don't have participation. So it's our duty as representatives of those minorities and those groups and those interests to put even more effort, unfortunately, to occupy them and to transform the way that we make those decisions happen. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Beatriz, obrigado, Dolphin.
Thank you. I don't understand Spanish, but I'll try to respond. About inclusion, sorry, I was at a SCF forum and Barbara Buchner highlighted inclusion. So I think I would use what you have basically, and what you have currently is the ACE, or called the Doha Work Program. So if you want inclusion for those who don't speak English or French or the official languages, I would advise that you align yourself with constituencies that sort of lobby for ACE, like the ECOS constituency basically. Then through them, they would be able to sort of, during the intervention, put up a request so that we have the inclusion of other languages. I think basically that would or might work. I think that is what I can say for the first question. For the other question, because you're working in reverse, I talked about mainstreaming ACE. So ACE is called Action for Climate Empowerment. And as part of the proposal of the Youth Fund institution, basically, our first agenda item is, it is called mainstreaming ACE into climate finance. So ACE has 6 elements: education, training, capacity building, public participation, all those 6 elements, basically. So I think having an ACE national focal point, ACE youth focal point, is just the beginning to open up the floor. After that, basically, we can have sort of mainstreaming into these particular topics, like mainstreaming ACE into climate finance, because ACE is much about capacity building. When you go to the grassroots, what are you going to capacity building about? I know my institution or my association is going to be capacity building on climate finance. So sort of you will have to capacity build on something, basically. And those something, of course, represent the key agenda items, basically. And I think just to conclude, of course, with a question on, I think, touch much on just transition. That's why we've developed another as part of the proposal, Youth in Green Growth Agenda, basically. So Youth in Green Growth Agenda is trying to be realistic in sort of a way. There are economies that are pegged on non-renewable sources of energy, such as oil, basically, and we are telling them to transition. So what we're looking to do is to explore how, within this particular transition, young people could be engaged and could be supported in a manner that the transition, they become the drivers to the green economy, so that, you know, you don't pull away the sort of support and leave young people hanging, you know, yet they're the next people basically to take over. So I think that is what I'd have to say, and I'd leave it at that.
Thank you very much. Sandra, for a really 1 minute comment.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. About the youth inclusion, I would say we are the one to make them see that we want to be involved in other thematics. Taking an example from my country, we are in different thematics as young negotiators, so we are the ones to show them that we want to know, we want to be involved in other thematics other than AC. And also, it's not only about these negotiations, like it's up to us to make a change and to tackle climate change. We don't have only to come to negotiations and negotiate. We have to go home and do something critical, like those little things, but they will surely make a change. Go home and tell people to turn off their lights, ride a bike, use a common transport. We are the ones to make a change. We are the ones who can finish these climate issues, because negotiations, it's like we're only talking, but if we want a better world for tomorrow, we are the one to work. Also, if I can make a small point about the loss and damage, you said about loss, what is adaptation loss? I think adaptation loss is those losses and damage we're talking about, because losses and damage are the negative impacts that we do not avoid through mitigation and adaptation. So those are the losses and damage that we're talking about, and we need finance to tackle them, but we also need to do our part as developing countries and developed countries. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sandra. And as we're almost running out of time, so as we said at the beginning, this side event, as the one we had already in Glasgow, is supposed to have concrete outputs. Otherwise, it's blah, 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 and we all agree that we're not blah, blah, blahing as youth organizations, right? So we will actually collect these inputs all together, and in a document that will be somehow filed into the Young Award ahead of COP27. And I would like Serena Bashal to conclude this side event and panel by wrapping up and summarizing what has been said and done in this past hour and a half. Thank you very much.
Thank you. My fellow panelists, you've made this very difficult because your inputs have been so brilliant. But okay, let's just quickly try. I'm going to try and do you guys justice. Starting with adaptation, talking about how there's this really, and I think actually this comes up a lot whenever the young people talk about adaptation, but a major imbalance between adaptation and mitigation finance, and that actually adaptation finance is just 1/4 of total climate finance. But I think we really want to be trying to make this a bit more balanced, so it's a bit more half-half, 50-50, and that adaptation is not forgotten, as Patricia Espinosa has mentioned before. At COP26, it was agreed that developed countries are to double adaptation finance, and this actually, if you count it all up, is worth hundreds of millions of dollars. But in terms of adaptation actions and policies, experts say this costs SIDS actually 1.4% of their annual GDP. And just to move on quickly to the GGA, the Global Goal on Adaptation, also which was discussed at COP26, there's been no major outcome on this so far. And hopefully this is something that we as young people can really lobby for and push for, and actually make sure something happens as we approach COP27 now. Also, just on that, so the majority of NDCs, and remember that these are all to be updated for this year, are conditional on foreign assistance, including on adaptation measures. Just realised I've been speaking on this one already for so long, so I might actually just skip the rest of the summary for adaptation. Yeah, okay, let's move on quickly to the loss and damage summary. So at COP26, there was a lot of talk and discussion about a loss and damage finance facility to address, but the thing is, this got, and has been ever since COP26, has just had a lot of dialogue, a lot of talk, a lot of, I guess we can say, blah, blah, blah. But in terms of the actual action and the actual making things happen, this is what is really, really lacking here. And so there are going to be, or due to be, more dialogues up until June 2024. But we actually need tangible action, tangible results. We need finance for loss and damage. And as Sandra was talking about, in the last 6 months, there has not actually been anything to talk about how we actually can help frontline communities who are really and truly suffering losses and damage to their homes and everything around their lives. And when it comes to loss and damage and coming up with solutions and action that everyone can take, it's really important to be listening to each other and seeing how everyone is really impacted by this and taking into account these voices of people most affected. So now we are in Bonn, continuing with the Glasgow dialogue, but this just seems to be like endless talk on and on. Okay, gonna move swiftly on. I can see we are now past time. Over to... It's hard, you know, because these guys have just said so many amazing things. How can I just summarize it so quickly? Okay, now over to Delphine talking about finance, and she touched nicely upon first adaptation financing and then loss and damage, and then some of her own remarks as well. So talking about when the money from climate finance, already spoken about this, how mitigation there's such an imbalance and mitigation has so much more finance, but maybe we can attribute this to the fact that when it comes to mitigation financing, it's so much more easier to quantify and it's a bit more tangible. For example, if you have the example of 1 million cook stoves, this is actually quite a tangible and easy to assess number. But then when it comes to adaptation, it's a bit more difficult, and there's a person who's giving this money, there's someone behind this transaction, and this donor, they need the money to be aligning to KPIs. They need to be seeing how their money is actually being used in some kind of quantifiable, tangible way. But also, when talking about receiving the financing, you have to set the domestic enabling environment. So, for example, is this country actually ready to receive money? Does this country have some kind of adaptation fund, for example, or some kind of national coordination mechanism to actually have this money come through and be used in an efficient and very optimal manner? But also, is there the political goodwill behind this mechanism? If the mechanism is even there in the first place, are there good intentions behind it? And again, this is another lobbying point that we as young people can push for. Onto loss and damage financing. The loss and damage, the money that would go towards this is often tucked under adaptation. So looking at a way, can we push to differentiate the two so that we can have an adequate amount going specifically to loss and damage? Although this is difficult because it's a bit less quantifiable, a bit less, it's a bit more intangible, I think. In general, there is no globally agreed definition of climate finance. Maybe this is something that... so the SCF, Standing Committee on Finance, is working on proposing a definition, a global definition of this. But I guess until this has been finalized, it will be difficult. Or this is something that also can be worked on in collaboration, joining these consultations to come up with some kind of definition. Okay, I'm going to just move on to the next one now. And on to Sarah, talking about fossil fuel phase out. So fossil fuels from the last century, important to remember this coming from a climate justice angle and this human rights angle, that the fossil fuels from the last century have really been from a lot of labor from the global south and relating to a lot of human rights abuses. However, talking about since COP26, the energy landscape has really changed a lot since COP26, and there were all of these various agreements and commitments, etc. However, the unprovoked invasion of Ukraine has really shifted the geopolitical landscape of energy, and this has really driven oil and gas prices to their highest in a decade. And of course, Russia is the world's largest oil exporter and a massive source to the EU as well. And this actually does provide a brilliant opportunity to double down investing on renewables. Just on that topic, actually, so Sarah was talking a lot about how some countries, quite a lot of countries actually are really increasing their renewable output, and she gave the examples of Germany and also the UK, the country that we are from. But how can this be fruitful and how can this be great and as good as they say it is, when they also have so many new fossil projects coming in, and Germany and the UK are still opening fossil fuel projects, which doesn't make any sense, but it is what it is. Again, another lobbying point right there. And actually, Sarah and I tried to lobby Alok Sharma on this a couple of days ago in a bilateral with him, and he kind of danced around the answer a bit. So I guess coming up with some kind of strategic way to make sure we do get a good answer on this. Okay, let's go on to the final topic right now. Okay, Beatrice talking about governance and youth. So just giving an example on the Brazilian NDC, and this was kind of like a bit manipulative and a bit of a scam, because actually they just delivered an even less ambitious NDC than what they already had. There was no increase in ambition, it was a decrease. So that's really not that great, but that's where the youth can come in and have these consultations and have these initiatives to push for greater ambition by making their own suggestions and bringing these lived experiences. In terms of the young people, we are the biggest representation of civil society at COP, also the longest running actual formalized group as well. But how meaningful is this participation? Because apart from filling side events like this one and having our meetings and all of this, is this actually having a good impact? And this, I guess, maybe no. Well, the answer is no, because the governments and the UN are still not listening to us, and we can see this every day. Our demands are not actually truly being implemented. However, Beatrice is working on an initiative called the Youth Climate Council Global Alliance, and has also suggested that initiatives like this one, and the idea behind this is to act as an institutional mechanism for meaningful youth participation, and to actually work as a forum where young people can really advise people in power and bring this, actually have a seat sitting at the table and bringing these inputs and this idea of co-creation and co-designing the process alongside the decision makers. And she has really given some inspirational words on how basically any youth from any country can push for this and can propose one to their governments or leaders and try and make this happen. And actually, there was a lot more, but I'm just going to close there because I'm way over time and I'm sorry about that. But so those were some kind of final remarks, and for me that was incredibly inspiring, and thank you so much to our panelists, and I hope for all of you in the room as well, it was very insightful and given a lot of inspiration on more lobbying points, more advocacy points, but also just general capacity building and educating for yourselves. So with that, thank you so much for coming, and see you all soon.
If everyone can clear the room as quickly as possible, just for the next one, since we're a bit late.